Good morning. Happy Friday. Welcome to the last ICAT Playdate of the semester. Can't believe it's almost the end of the semester. It always goes fast. Good morning. My name is Phyllis Newbill. I'm the Associate Director of Educational Networks in one of several ICAT centers, the Center for Educational Networks and Impacts. Get my right thing here. We are videoing this morning, as always, so the 360 camera is here in the middle of the room. If you're watching online, good morning. Thanks for joining us, and feel free to move the cursor all around to see the whole room. But you all are being filmed and will exist online afterwards, so behave accordingly. There's a sign-in clipboard moving about the room. Please make sure you sign in, because that's how we justify the next item on the agenda, which is coffee and donuts. So make sure you sign in for that. Also, when you have questions, wait for me to get to you with the mic. If you're here for PDN credit, let me know that you're here, but I got those of you who are in the room. And if you're online, if you'll send me a note either via email or using the questions link on the page, I can get you that credit. Couple of announcements today. Acoustic Invasion, which I think you all are probably going to mention that there's a show going on tomorrow from 10 to 4 in the Cube, and then also on May 1st, as part of the ICAT Creativity and Innovation Day, we'll take over all of the Moss Arts Center lobbies and the Perform Studio, Cube, and Sandbox. And today too. Is it open today? It'll be today 10 to 4? Okay, all right. So also today, you can go by and see it in the Cube. Sorry, thank you. And come to all of ICAT Day. It's going to be amazing. Lots of almost 30 exhibits, many cool things to see. I hope you'll spend some time over there. Also, the New Music Technology Festival is May 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, so Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. May 1st is here, and then 2nd and 3rd is in the Cube. All right. With that, I'm so excited for this exploration of sound and environments and how the things we mess up in the environment sound. So I'm not going to talk any more about it. I want to turn it on over to the team. Jacob, take it away.
Thank you, Phyllis. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. We're really excited to share this with you this morning because this is sort of the first of a weekend of events for us. This has been a really fun, very interdisciplinary project. You can see we've got several units on campus. We've got faculty, postdocs, graduate students. It's been a really collaborative process, and if we have time later, I'll tell you the origin story of how we got here, but we're interested in a unique aspect of invasion. And you've all heard of invasion? Yes, this is in the news a lot. Do you know what one is? Can you define one? Come on, Ben. Ooh, wasn't hoping to go there, but yes. Okay. Garlic mustard, yes. Okay, great examples. And they're generally defined as an organism that's not native to that location, that has some sort of harmful impact. This is a federal definition. There's a piece of this definition that's missing, is that we humans play a fundamental role in moving these species around, either on purpose or on accident. Some examples that you're all aware of course, kudzu, also known as the vine that ate the South. This was an intentionally introduced plant. The government subsidized it. And in the early 1900s, there were some folk tales that if you had it on your property, you better sleep with your windows closed because it'll snatch your kids, because that's how fast it would grow. We've got feral hogs. This is probably the most damaging invasive species in Virginia, intentionally introduced for hunting, has all kinds of other consequences. We've got this amazingly scary critter, the snakehead fish, which is in all the rivers in eastern Virginia. It's a predator, but it also can walk on land. Like, whoa. That's a pretty amazing capability for a fish. And then now we are soon going to be under the invasion of the red imported fire ant. And that's a terrifying picture of a mass of fire ants floating in a flood, which is how they can disperse. Can you imagine swimming into that? That would be terrifying. But we care about these species because they cause all kinds of undesirable impacts. They're tremendously expensive. They threaten our native species diversity, which we care about in preserving. They can change how our ecosystems function in sometimes irreversible ways. And in some cases, they can actually cause the full-scale extinction of native species, which is sort of the worst-case scenario. And just some specific examples here. In the top left, we got the brown tree snake, which was accidentally introduced to Guam during World War II and has subsequently caused the extinction of like 13 of 15 bird species. They've eaten like all the lizards. It's a tragically terrible situation. Wildfires are now linked to invasive species invasion. We have infrastructure like kudzu Jesus up there that you see all over the southeastern United States. All due respect, just kidding. Water bodies, all kinds of terrible consequences of invasive species. There's also some links to human health. Of course, COVID, you could certainly consider an invasive species. But this is a picture of Japanese barberry, which is an ornamental plant that has escaped into the forest. And there's been recent research showing that when a forest becomes invaded by barberry, it changes the microclimate such that tick populations increase, and Lyme disease subsequently increases following invasion of barberry. Has anybody ever seen a Japanese barberry before? You all have, because it's the logo. Yeah, so this is a plant you can still buy now. I've talked to facilities, and they're like, you can't replace the logo, that's sacrosanct. Okay, but anyway, that's an example of the sort of duality of invasive species. This is a picture of the border between Texas and Mexico, where there's an introduced plant that was planted there to stabilize soil banks. Now is a focus of biological control from Border Patrol because of illegal immigration crossing and hiding in that. And there's a photo of me and my students holding one of the canes of this plant. It's like 25 feet tall. You could see how easy it would be to hide there. The world's going to become increasingly invaded. The invasive species that are here now are things that were introduced decades to 100 years ago, and so it's being an increasingly invaded place. And of course, this impacts Virginia as well. Cropping systems, all of our ecosystems, our indigenous peoples are all suffering the consequences of invasion. And so we know a lot about the impacts of invasive species, and that's what we care about, but we don't know everything, and this was the genesis for this project, Acoustic Invasion.
So it's true, we don't know everything about invasive species. And that's in part because we may be asking the wrong questions, or we haven't figured out the right questions rather to ask. For example, when you look at this picture, what do you see? What does it make you feel? What does it evoke from you? If you were to saddle up to this nice, cool pond on a hot summer day, what would you expect? Well, the same thing with that pond is occurring in these beautiful examples of these natural settings, beautiful wildlife, expansive wild spaces. Yet, we are such a visually oriented species, we forget that there's something else out there beyond what we can just see. We don't see the whole picture, per se, because we're not considering beyond the landscape we can look out and see. There's also a soundscape that surrounds us and extends out beyond as well. And so, while ecologists have started considering how human noises have been impacting natural settings and our enjoyment of those natural settings, such as like how we've passed legislation for the Wilderness Act to prevent mechanical devices in wilderness, so it's more natural per se, as well as considering how human noises are impacting wildlife, such as with Navy activity harming whales in the Pacific Northwest. But that's a very anthropogenic view of it. We may actually be, through the movement of species to new places, be changing the soundscape through biological means. So we decided to ask, what does an invaded ecosystem sound like? Beyond the noises we make, when we move around species, we may be creating entirely new and novel soundscapes that impact the local and native flora and fauna. And so to answer that question, we had to figure out something that would really be easy to detect. And while something that you may have thought of in that original picture, like saddling up to a pond and hearing bullfrogs calling as the sun sets on a hot summer day, well, that pond was in Arizona, and bullfrogs don't belong there.
Thanks, Joe. So as Joe said, and he kind of set the stage for us, this is the American bullfrog, and they are native, as you can see in the blue range, up here to eastern North America. And you can kind of, probably guess from the name, right, that that's sort of where we tend to find this species. But over the last 100 years or so, they've been moved all over the globe, including the western US and western North America, but also in many other parts of the globe. And in this case, as Jacob sort of talked about earlier, we have lots of different vectors for invasive species. Sometimes they sort of hitchhike along human routes of transportation. Sometimes it's accidental, but in a lot of cases, we've actually moved a bunch of species on purpose. And that's true for the bullfrog as well. And so this is a sort of advertisement from a newspaper in probably about the 1930s, where you too can raise your giant frogs and move them all over the place. And one of the things that this ad and sort of others of the time really espouse is how well bullfrogs can establish in lots of different environments. So they're cheap, they're fast growing, and they outcompete everything, right? Which is great if you want to raise bullfrogs for frog legs and for food, which was often the motivation. But it's not great when we start thinking about their effects on aquatic native species and biodiversity. And so I want to tell you a little bit about where we conducted our study, which is the southwestern US, this little yellow box that you can see where the arrow is pointing. So this is an area of sort of the high desert where we work. And bullfrogs have been in this region for probably about 75 years, as best we can tell. And the photo that you can see here is an example of what happens when you have even just a few bullfrogs, sometimes even one gravid female that set up shop in some of the very scarce surface water that's available in this region. They're very highly fecund, so you get lots of offspring. And when state agencies and federal agencies go in to try to remove them so that we have these bullfrog-free areas where you can, sort of have environments that are more friendly to our native species, this is an example of a haul from a seine net. So this net was dragged across a pond, and these are all tadpoles, likely from one cohort. So that's it's really a phenomenal amount of biomass. And this can come out of ponds that are no bigger than the room that we're sitting in. So you can imagine that this is a major disruption. There are not native species that reproduce in this way. Bullfrogs also spread disease. So have any of you heard of the chytrid fungus for amphibians? So this is a disease that has wiped out many native species, particularly in the tropics, all over the globe, and invasive species like bullfrogs tend to be a vector. So they can carry chytrid, and it's not nearly as damaging to them and to their populations as it is to native species. So they're a disease vector. They eat anything that can fit in their mouths, and bullfrogs can get huge, right? So they eat not just amphibians, but terrestrial organisms, snakes, bats, you name it, literally anything that gape, can kind of fit around. So voracious predators, and they tend to outcompete, as you might imagine, the species that we do see at these ponds. So one of the species that is near and dear to my heart is the Arizona tree frog, which is shown here. This is a species native to the Sonoran Desert. And the region where we work, the Huachuca Mountains, which are shown here on the slide, this is an area called a sky island in sort of the southwest. Have any of you heard of the sky islands of the southwestern US? So it's sort of as it describes, or as it sounds, these are a series of mountain ranges that are isolated by sort of seas of desert. And so in these mountain ranges, we have just phenomenal hotspots of biodiversity, particularly aquatic biodiversity, where the region is otherwise quite dry. So this is where we've seen lots of diversification of species, including the Arizona tree frog. So this is the state amphibian for Arizona, and it's one that we have studied for years in my lab using acoustic methods to listen for where they are. And Grace is going to tell you a little bit more about that in a second. But at some point, we started to realize, okay, we're putting these acoustic recorders out at ponds. These ponds dry sometimes, as you can see up top, and sometimes they keep water year-round. And for those especially that have water year-round, we find bullfrogs there sometimes. So we got really curious about, you have this new amphibian. As you might guess from the name, it sounds like a bull. It's got a really different acoustic sound. So can we detect what they're doing, where they're moving, and also can we start thinking about how they're fundamentally changing the soundscape that not just we hear, but that these organisms hear as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Grace.
All right, so as Meryl said, we wanted to investigate the soundscape and see if bullfrogs are actually changing the soundscape as well. So what we did was we deployed these acoustic recorders at a whole bunch of ponds throughout the region. As Meryl said, we deployed them at ponds that sometimes dry down, sometimes have water all year round. And so these recorders record about 12 hours a day for 5 months out of the year to capture the rainy season when bullfrogs and tree frogs are most active. So this is an example of our acoustic recordings. On the left, we have a screenshot of the Arizona tree frog chorus, and on the right, we have a screenshot of a bullfrog call. And so I want to just play these for you as well, so you can hear them. So this is a single Arizona tree frog calling. Super cute, they sound like little ducks. And then here's a chorus. So you can imagine as there's, potentially hundreds of these tree frogs, these choruses can get really, really deafening. And you can see on that image there, the red is the decibel level, and then we also have frequency too. So the tree frog calls are a bit higher in frequency compared to our lower bullfrog calls, and so this might be a little bit more familiar. Of our friend the bullfrog. So, not really our friend, I guess. But so using these acoustic recordings, we actually documented a co-occurrence of these species. So we found a bullfrog at the same site as these tree frogs. So again, you can see the tree frog calls, the chorus, they're a bit higher in frequency, and we have the bullfrog calls that are lower in frequency at the end there. But these tree frogs, as you heard, they call in really loud choruses. And so, like we said before, are these bullfrog calls actually biologically relevant? Are they loud enough that we can hear them over the tree frogs? Do the tree frogs hear them? What's going on? So I just want to play another example of a tree frog chorus with bullfrogs also. However, the tree frog chorus is going to be so loud that you're not going to even be able to hear the bullfrogs. So I promise there are bullfrogs in this recording, but just go ahead and listen. So as you can imagine, again, there's possibly hundreds of tree frogs calling in that chorus, and you can't even hear the bullfrogs. So in some cases, the bullfrogs might be there and calling, but the tree frogs are just so numerous and so loud that they can't even hear them. But in other situations where there's less tree frogs, we might see the impacts of those bullfrogs. And so moving away from the bullfrogs and the bullfrogs who are vocalizing and calling themselves, we also wanted to investigate and see if silent invasive species also are affecting the soundscape. And so the way to do this is to turn that acoustic data, those sounds that I played for you, into measurable, comparable indices of diversity. So we can put those acoustic recordings through a software that calculates these diversity and evenness indexes of the sound that is present. And so to test that, we used Japanese stiltgrass here in Virginia, which is an invasive plant. This plant kind of carpets the ground and has been shown to affect amphibian communities. And so we were really interested if we were to just listen, what's going on, where there's stiltgrass and where there's not stiltgrass. So we deployed acoustic recorders that recorded for about 10 days. They recorded 24/7, and so we were just listening for the soundscape. We just wanted to see if it was different. And so after we collected those recordings, we put them through that software that I was talking about that converts these into acoustic indices so that we can actually quantify and compare these soundscape values. So I want to share with you some very preliminary and pilot results from this. So just to orient you, we're going to walk through this chart really quick. So on the bottom, we're going to have acoustic diversity indices calculated every hour for 8 days. So we have the days across, and then on the y-axis going up and down, we have acoustic diversity. So each point that's going to be on this plot represents the acoustic diversity index from 1 hour of recording at that day. And the higher the point is, the higher the diversity of the soundscape is. So again, really preliminary results, but this is what the soundscape is looking like in a forest with Japanese stiltgrass. So we have the invaded in red, so that's where the stiltgrass is present, and then we have the control in the green. And what we can see, and so remember, each of these points is a number measuring diversity, and these lines are just placed to show trends. And so we can see that the acoustic diversity in both sites kind of peaks around midnight. So you can see how it peaks at night going in from one day to the next, and then lowers during the day and then peaks again. But really, really interestingly, we can see in the invaded plot with the Japanese stiltgrass that in general, the diversity at those sites are lower. And so we are actually measuring and directly quantifying the effects of this plant on the invasive soundscapes. But again, this is preliminary pilot data, and we're really excited to hopefully investigate this more in the future, because this was only conducted over a week. So we're really interested to see what does different types of weather do to these trends, and what are different things that we might see in different seasons. So, David.
So, how do you hear what this stuff sounds like aside from Grace's awesome frog recordings? And well, you could go to Pindapas Pond and walk around and hear it for yourself, or we could do it for you and bring it to you. So I'm gonna go real quick and quack, because we're at the end of our time here. But so we did some immersive audio and video recordings in both Arizona and in Virginia for both of these studies, and brought them back here. So that's our awesome team doing these field recording gatherings, the things that you have to do: hike, climb over barbed wire fences, carry metal posts so you can put recorders on them, all those sorts of things. And we created an installation in the Cube at the Moss Arts Center. So we took all these immersive audio and video recordings. These are actual photos of how it was last night. This opens today and tomorrow, and it'll be up Monday too. So you can come and experience it for yourself and hear and see what these places sound like and look like. Here's the flyer for it that hopefully you've seen around campus. So hope you can come out and experience it. And I'll just let this little behind the scenes video play real quick while we say thank you to everybody who made this possible. ICAT for funding this research, and all of your units for allowing you to be a part of this. It's been a lot of fun, and it seems like we're going to be taking this farther with some other grants too, which is awesome. So we hope you can all come out and check it out. And ICAT Day on Monday should be, some of the team will be there to actually talk about the research and go through things in more detail if you're interested in that. So with that, thank you. I'll just say that. Questions?
What questions do we have in the room? I've got one while we're waiting for that awkward pause. Can you all say what disciplines you are coming from?
I am coming from creative technologies and visual arts.
I am a PhD student in the Department of Biological Sciences.
Postdoc in bio.
I'm an associate professor in biological sciences, and in our group we focus on conservation ecology with a focus on freshwater ecosystems.
I'm an associate professor in the School of Plant and Environmental Sciences, and I'm an invasive plant ecologist.
I love this. Thanks for this presentation. I'm a social scientist, and I live in the residence hall here. And sound is a really interesting thing. There are moments when this space right here has like the perfect diversity of sound. We can hear students working, we can hear maybe music from rehearsal and performance. There's like the right, sometimes there's like too much noise, sometimes it's spectacularly quiet. I think sometimes when we're looking for a place to work, we want just the right amount of noise. I wonder if you have any ideas based on your experience about how this strategy for thinking about soundscapes could be applied in human spaces, shared human spaces. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'll go ahead and say we do not have any social scientists on the team, and I think that's something we may want to think about as we take this further. But from a biologist standpoint, if we think about sort of in the natural environment, what's so interesting is the way that we perceive sound is really different often from how species perceive it. And so many amphibians, some of which we've shown, can have hearing that's tuned for just a very specific frequency. And I guess that's not so different from humans. There's a lot that goes on in our world that we can't hear. I don't know if any of you heard the story, it was on NPR maybe a few weeks ago, about plants actually making noise. It's just that it's at a frequency that we cannot register. And so we think of them as silent, but that's just because that's how we perceive them. So I don't know, if there's sort of a right amount of noise. We do know that in the ecosystems where we're working, noise changes throughout the season. So you can imagine in that desert landscape, when we're coming out of the dry season, there's very little going on. When you go to those ponds, it's generally fairly quiet. You might hear some crickets and that's it. But after the rains start and when those ponds start to fill, about 4 to 6 weeks later, it's not just deafening because of the amphibian choruses. There are insects and everything else that's out there, birds, all sorts of things calling into the night. So there is sort of that same cadence that you mentioned here, and I think that's really interesting. Could be something really cool to explore. Grace, do you want to say anything else about? Yeah, okay.
I'll just add one more thing. We think about biodiversity as being a thing we care about and preserving biodiversity. We're also thinking about acoustic diversity as maybe a different axis of diversity that is a little underappreciated at this point. And so we've got some strong preliminary data to suggest that acoustic diversity actually decreases or changes in a measurable way. And so we're leveraging this preliminary data, seeking larger NSF style funding to see if we can't quantify this further.
Thank you. And related to that, I wonder, have you, specifically to that diversity graph, are the various members providing sounds into that diversity index? I assume some of those are native species and what we can think of as the positive diversity, as opposed to relatively new actors or members that are not. Have you had any ability to start discerning each of that's obviously a lot of species, but but since they make sounds, presumably they're diagnostic, and I think that could also be valuable in your analyses going forward.
Super great question. The answer to this point is no. We were able to generate preliminary data showing it is different, which was step one. We've since received some internal funding through CALS, where we're going to be feeding new acoustic data through machine learning to try to pick out which species are there and aren't there. But that's a really big ask, because there's a lot of things that make sound, and so we're working on it. We don't know that yet, but that's sort of the next piece of who is changing and then why.
Yeah, so to go off of what Jacob was talking about with the machine learning, so just for some broader context, I've been working on building kind of an automated identifier that when I feed it acoustic data, it will tell me when and where the bullfrogs and tree frogs are. And so it's a very iterative process to kind of train that model to identify what you want it to identify. And I've been working on that for about 2 years now. So it's a long iterative process. And it's something that, we're all new to. And so, yeah, so it's, there's potential to identify specific species, but right now, it would just be way too much to identify like all the species, if that makes sense. So, yeah, hope that provides context.
And I didn't know, we don't have time for two directions of questions. One is on how do we get rid of these things. But on the artistic side of things, we just had a talk last Playdate on sonifying the coronavirus. And this would be interesting to have somebody that actually could look at the music of these environments and maybe even compose something to them for the reason of beauty, but also for the reason of, can you discover things both quantitatively in the spectrogram analysis, but also qualitatively in just listening to how this sounds, and maybe there are qualities of the environment that you might learn from that as well. So just an idea.
That's hopefully a little bit what this thing in the cube will do a little bit. Just, I mean, like, I'm not like being facetious, like, you know, like striving for like, what does it feel like to be there? And this like diversity of sound through multiple places in Arizona mixed with multiple places in Virginia. So hopefully you'll get a little bit of that there, I hope.
Well, we are at time, so I want to thank you to the team for your great work and for sharing it with us. I can't wait to see it in the cube, see it and hear it in the cube. And also thank you to you all for coming today, and also all semester long. We'll start up again in the fall in the first week of classes, and we'll be back to do it again. All right, have a great weekend and summer.